me to be here at the graveside of Frank Driver, a pivotal Republican over the last number of generations. And I want to thank everybody who's been involved in organising today's event. And I have to say, I've worked with the Republicans here in Wicklow for many a year, and a lot of the difficulties that they had over those years, I've done my best to see could I represent them and help them in that. And I have to say I'm very proud to be here with Councillor John Snell, Councillor Jerry O'Neill and Councillor Oliver Bryan from Wicklow, and I see there's a large number of other councillors from across the country here today as well. I suppose today that one of the things that is important is we are obviously all here as Irish Republicans. And Frank Driver was one of those amazing Irish Republicans who led by example. And when Frank Driver was born, Ireland was controlled by the largest empire that the world had ever seen. The Union Jack flew over Ballymore Eustace and every single town in Wicklow and Kildare at the time. And a version of that flag had flown over these towns for at least 500 years. And you have to remember that Frank's generation wasn't a generation that was on a high. It was a generation that came very recent after the famine. It was a generation that was broken. And yet, to that generation, it must have seemed absolutely impossible to remove that flag. A flag that had been there for maybe 600 years. But that's exactly what Frank Driver's generation sought to do. He was 13 years old when the men and women of Dublin rose up against the Empire in 1916, and that had a massive effect on him. And he saw what was possible when a broad movement of Irish Republicans worked together, planned together, and become activists together. And at the age of 15, he was centrally involved in the 1918 election, which saw a majority of Irish people vote for Irish independence. And he went to go on to become an IRA volunteer in the Tan War. And he stood firmly with the objectives of the proclamation, right through that war and through the Civil War as well. He was the youngest internee in Newbridge Barracks in 1922. And when he was released, he remained an active volunteer through the 30s and 40s until he was again interned in the Curragh, along with 500 other volunteers. When in the Curragh, he joined the Irish Language Hut. For Frank had a great love of the Irish language, and he knew how important that the Irish language was to the national struggle, and he recognised the beauty of the language as well. While in the Curragh, Frank Driver did not waste any time, and he set about excavating a escape tunnel. But unfortunately that plan was frustrated, and as a result he was one of the last prisoners to be released from the Curragh just as the World War II came to an end. On his release, he poured all his energy into revitalising the Republican movement, a movement that was nearly broken at the time. And it was said of Frank Driver that he stayed steadfast in defeat, and when the majority ebbed away from him, he was like a rock in the Republican movement as the tide retreated. He continued his resistance through in the 50s and 60s. And in the late 60s, when the inequalities of the Orange State became too much for the nationalist communities, when nationalists were being denied equal voting rights, when nationalists were being denied the same chance to housing and to jobs because of their religion, when they were being beaten off the streets and being shot off the streets, when they were banned from the airwaves and prevented from politically organising, when most of Ireland stood idly by, Frank Driver remained steadfast in the protection of the people of the north of Ireland. And he built a new political generation. And because his life stretched back to 1916, he was an inspiration to the next generation. And indeed we have people like Councillor Jerry O'Neill here today who served part of his political apprenticeship under the influence and inspiration of Frank Driver. Frank died in 1981 at the age of 74, and he was still in the Republican harness when he died. Nibai Alahaid and Rish, of course. Now I want to say one thing. Commemoration is very important for a number of reasons. Commemoration is important because we owe people like Frank Driver and the other Republicans deep respect for what they've done for this country. It's important to look at the actions and the sacrifice that they've been involved in and to pay homage to that. But commemoration is also important because it allows us to learn about their lives. It allows us to learn about their ideology and about their strategies. and it allows us to understand that Frank Driver remained steadfast to the Republican ideas of 1916. But commemoration is also important because it allows us to take stock of where we are today. It allows us to analyse the political landscape in which we live in. And I have to say, Accordia, for me, Irish independence is closer today than it has been for generations. The shock of Brexit has awoken the establishment to just how illogical the border is in this country. 102 years after the 1916 Rising, when those people fought for self-determination, Irish people now realise that our future is still, in part, governed by London. 102 years after the 1916 Rising, the determination of the citizens of the North to stay within the EU is being ignored yet again. The cost of the border is coming into sharp focus for tens of thousands of people around the country. For the first time in the opinion polls in the north of Ireland, it shows that a majority for unity is not just feasible, but at certain age groups, it's actually a reality already. For the first time in generations, the goals and the ideals of Frank Driver are in touching distance. But Accordia, none of this is guaranteed. And imagine if we got this close, only for the whole thing to come tumbling down again and for us to be left back where we were 20 or 30 years ago. And despite the significant change in views, there still exists two establishments on the island of Ireland. And as Liam Mellows predicted, those establishments will rely on the border to protect their political strength. If the border disappeared tomorrow, Fine Gael would shrink from being the ruling party to being a small regional party, and a party of self-interest will not allow this to happen. They will make every excuse under the sun. They will say now is not the right time. They will say that the basis of the Good Friday Agreement, that the majority of the population, that's no longer enough. We need 60 or 70% of unionists to do this. And just in recent days, Fine Gael in Leinster House has prevented the formation of a committee on Irish unity. And they said because it's not the right time. And Fianna Fáil are no different. There is a shrinking number of Republicans in that party who are being held hostage by a paralysed Micheál Martin. Micheál Martin is scared to make a decision because he knows if he fails to make a decision, he will actually lose his position. And my God, Accordia, it makes me sick to say this today, but republicanism is not in a great state at the moment in this country. In 1916 and 1918, republicanism was a broad front of people. Everybody from different sectors of society coming together to fight for Irish independence. You had people like Cathal Brugha and W.T. Cosgrave, believe it or not, on the same side to fight for that. And also, it was not just a broad front, but it was a grassroots activist organisation spread around the country. It wasn't a centrally controlled organisation where the decisions were made from the top and forced down onto people below. They empowered the collective activism of their generation, and they remained resilient against groupthink. Now, it is my view that centralised politics is the curse of the Irish political system currently at the moment. That groupthink is the curse of the political system at the moment. And we see this in my former political party. The ideological drift that's happening in Sinn Féin currently is unbelievable. A number of months ago, Mary Lou MacDonald and Michelle O'Neill went to London to ask them to legislate on a number of different issues for the north of Ireland. Now, for 200 years, Republicans have tried to stop London legislating for any part of Ireland. And for the first time, unprecedented, Mary Lou was going to Westminster to ask them to do the opposite. That's not the meaning of self-determination. It's the opposite of self-determination. Recently, the leader of Sinn Féin stated that a border poll mightn't be a good thing at the moment because of the crisis within Brexit. Lord, make us free, but just not right now, was what Mary Lou was saying in that particular sentence, which is incredible. And the party have been flying kites around the poppy and the Commonwealth for a long period of time, and their core vote is becoming uneasy. And in the last number of years, that party has radically narrowed the ideological space in which it functions. It has reduced the space so much that I am surrounded by fine Republicans here who no longer have a place in that political organisation? What kind of organisation tells people who have toiled for 20 and 30 years that we no longer need you or want you? Is unity not that important that everybody should be involved in an organisation to build that particular unity? And what we're seeing at the moment is a grassroots that's so disempowered that they are shedding membership by the busload. Now, I genuinely wish this wasn't so. I genuinely wish there were wiser heads in that organisation. But it's clear to me, in the experience that I've had, and looking at the face around me here today, that that's not going to change. Groupthink is a difficulty in all those political parties. It captures ministers at the highest levels. It makes clones of TDs who are too afraid to speak what they feel, who have one eye on the leadership looking for brownie points and one eye on their seat trying to make sure they keep that seat. They have no eyes left for their constituents whatsoever. What needs to happen, I believe, is we need to make a broad-based, activist-controlled organisation from the bottom up, where members are not just canvas fodder. Policy by focus group has disempowered membership base right across the country. And all the political parties want to inhabit exactly the same space and time on certain issues on the political spectrum. And this is a dangerous thing. For you, if you exclude certain voices from the Dáil, you marginalise those people. And if you marginalise those people, they will vote for people on the margins. Respectful opposition is not the enemy. It is a critical part of a functioning democracy. Now, I've attended a number of meetings over the last week, and those meetings have been jammed stuffed. And there have been people from Fianna Fáil backgrounds, people from Sinn Féin backgrounds, some from the left and some from other political parties. And the frustration is absolutely incredible. It's like lifting the weights off a pressure cooker in those particular meetings. People are saying they have nobody to vote for. They are disenfranchised from the democratic system at the moment. And this must change, Accordia. It must change for a number of reasons. It must change, first of all, because we live in one of the most divisive countries in the world currently. We have a situation where 83 of the richest people who have a net worth of over 50 million euros are paying tax at a level of a person on the average industrial wage, which is 35,000 euros. There's 141 people who have an income of over 50 million euros in this country who are paying tax of about 125,000 euros. We have vulture funds who own 4 billion euros worth of homes at the moment, grinding out any profit they can make of these people, putting farmers, businesses and households out of their houses and their businesses. And we have Fine Gael allowing them to asset strip this country. Michael Noonan even himself says, vultures, you know, they're an important part of our ecology. That's no good, Michael, if your family is part of that carcass. And the vulture funds are untouchable. They don't come before the Finance Committee in Leinster House. They have been invited 125 times and said no, but they're in and out of the Department of Finance anytime they want. We have foreign investors earning 238 million euros of profits in Irish properties at the moment and paying a tax rate of 2%. And all of this is happening when 1 million people are locked out of healthcare, housing and education as well. The reason why we need a broad front, I believe, is Irish unity is in touching distance. And we need a Republican organisation that is strong enough to harness the energy of the people, all of the people, to achieve that. To do justice to Frank Driver and the people before, I believe that we need to see that this moment in time is the start of something new. That in this windy, cold, grey graveyard, at the edge of a Republican legend, that we commit to developing an organisation in some form, in cooperation with each other, with input from everybody. That is a grassroots movement, that is an organisation that goes from the bottom to the top, that has freedoms of conscience, that respects diversity of views and builds for the future. So let us go from this graveyard today and let's make sure that the objectives of Frank Driver are achieved in our time. Gur míle maith agaibh go leor.